Right, hey guys, how we doing? Back with another video from Annie News, getting up to date with the cut content from MUSHOKU TENSEI Season 2. This should be covering episode 6, and this would be all about the slave girl. That was dark. That was dark. I thought it was a bit of a dark scene, but then I saw a clip on Twitter of like a picture from the manga, and I was like, wow, it's even darker, so... Let's see what was maybe different or left out or changed or... Yeah, I love these videos. Annie News does a great job with these.
It wasn't really all that controversial.
Oh.
To be honest, that was just clickbait referring to how Twitter perceived the episode.
Right.
But since you're already here, you might as well stick around to see why it is Rudy said what he said here.
Okay.
I think the anime did it fairly well, but there's always those extra details from the novels that give a bit more insight.
So the way she said... Instead of saying, I want to live, it was, I don't want to die. It's like, ooh.
You might also be interested in seeing just how well the manga captured Juliet's despair.
Okay.
Aside from that, though, the biggest portions of cut content were from Sylphie's perspective.
All
It was
right.
an entire chapter dedicated to a single day of her life.
Oh.
One that not only highlights what she did every day before RUDEUS, but also just how much of that time was spent thinking about him.
Oh.
So, just like how we do every week, let's take a look at what the latest Mushoku Tensei episode left out from the novels. Prior to anything that happened in the episode, there was first an entire chapter relating to Sylphie and one of her regular school days.
Like, I still don't get how Rudy hasn't clocked on, but we'll get there, I hope.
She'd just woken up from an amazing dream and her body was feeling great because of it.
Nice.
It was a dream in which Rudy had just made love to her. She didn't remember why that was, but what she did remember was
Oh.
just how happy it made her.
Oh my god, bloody hell.
So, Sylphie would then put on her typical jogging clothes, then tiptoe through the room next to hers which housed a sleeping princess. A princess we can assume is Princess Ariel, but the identity of the person next to her is a bit more up to debate here.
Oh.
A key thing you need to remember is that at this point in the novels, Fitz's identity is still a mystery. Sylphie's whereabouts haven't been mentioned since the Fatoa incident, and this would be the first time we're seeing her since then. That being the case, it becomes a rather peculiar situation when Sylphie refers to the person next to the princess as Fitz. An attendant just like her who's described to have white hair, a sword at their side, and a large pair of sunglasses. If it wasn't for the mention of this Fitz having a sword, then I would assume Sylphie was just describing herself.
Yeah.
An alter ego she created that the author is using as a misdirect. But since the description doesn't quite match, I'm inclined to believe that it's a separate person. Especially since the job of this person is to watch the princess while she sleeps and ring a bell if there's ever any trouble.
That's confusing. That's quite confusing. Why do that? Huh.
An alarm which would then summon the princess's knight and another attendant. Obviously, we know that knight to be Luke, so we can only assume the other attendant is Sylphie. The thing is, what makes this whole scenario so strange is not only the Fitz person Sylphie is supposedly talking to, but the confusing statements after in which Sylphie describes him as her friend and even a student she teaches voiceless casting to.
Huh.
It seems they really want to make it clear that Fitz and Sylphie are separate people here.
Yeah.
Of course, we know that not to be true, but it's that very knowledge that just goes to make this whole thing all the more confusing.
Can't wait for Rudy to find out.
In any case, Sylphie's daily routine would start with a jog. Something she'd started ever since Rudy left, since to her being able to run even after you were at your limit could very well be the difference between life and death. It didn't matter how good you were at magic or swordplay, because if you ran out of energy, then that was it for you.
Yeah, like what are you gonna do after
So
that?
every day, Sylphie would train her
Stay
stamina to the point that she could
energized.
run no longer. Not only did this help her familiarize herself with Sharia's layout, but it also taught her what her limits were. Once back at the university dorm, the princess would usually be awake, and that would mean it was time for Fitz and herself to help her get ready. She would sometimes make these selfish requests, but that was all part of working for her. She did, after all, save her during the displacement incident. It may have been for the princess's own personal benefit, but that was all part of her character too. You see, after years of seeing her smile in a way that bewitched others, Sylphie had come to realize that the princess only smiled for herself. She would put on a face that reassured those she was talking to, then use their lowered defenses to manipulate them in whatever way was most beneficial to her.
So she's got a bit of a manipulative side.
It was a tactic that this princess used frequently, one that made Sylphie question whether any of her smiles were real.
Oh gosh.
As insincere as these expressions were, though, Sylphie still believed Ariel to be her friend, perhaps even her best friend. Ariel may not think the same, but the truth of the matter was that she had helped Sylphie when Sylphie needed it most. So if this was the trying time in which Sylphie could return the favor, then Sylphie was more than happy to do so.
Bless.
She also just liked being able to help people. Ever since she'd found out her parents had died during the displacement incident, there wasn't really anything Sylphie wanted to do. Sure, if something came up, then she would definitely shift her focus to it, but until then, assisting the princess was something she was content with.
She's got at the moment,
There was a certain satisfaction that came from knowing she was helping someone with such lofty ambitions.
And then as soon as Rudy turns up, it's like, whoa, okay, hey, there's my one thing, gonna help.
If we switch to Sylphie's classes next, most of them were rather boring to her. Since a lot were on combined magic and the phenomenon created by it, they were nowhere near as comprehensive as the lessons Rudeus had given her. Reason being that, rather than explain why these phenomena occurred, they would instead ignore the explanation completely. There was this significant gap in knowledge stemming from a lack of scientific understanding. As for why Sylphie participated anyway, well, that's because graduating meant becoming part of the Magician's Guild.
Right.
And according to her, being a member meant you could easily become a professor of magic anywhere. The class that Sylphie did find a bit more interesting was the practical skills class, which focused more on battle experience.
I love the whole, like, the circles being explained that, like, they do healing magic, so, yeah, you can kind of, like, attack each other and inflict some damage, but obviously you can't, like, kill, you know.
Since this was taken amongst those who were adventurers, the mock battles she took part in proved to be invaluable. A lot of the students didn't like it when their oldest classmate Fricht would run around the arena and use both magic and melee attacks, but that was just a testament to how serious he took this.
Fair, yeah.
It was a display of resolve that reminded her of Rudy, one that she had grown rather fond of. Now, once all her classes were finished, Sylphie would return to looking after the princess, a task that today would involve a shopping trip. The trip itself wasn't very important, but there was a brief moment in which Sylphie envisioned her ideal relationship. Basically, she wanted monogamy. She wasn't a member of the Millis faith, but ideally she would want Rudy to be hers alone.
Aww.
Of course, knowing Rudy and the family he comes from, she knew it was a bit much to expect Rudy to settle with one wife. And it was for that reason that she knew she needed
his dad's like, yeah, of course, Jesus.
to keep an open mind about it. So, if Rudy did ever bring another girl home, then Sylphie knew her best course of action as his wife was to act as the mediator.
Oh my god,
she would acknowledge that Rudy loved her too, maintain a balanced relationship between all three of them, then do her best to keep everyone happy. That was the life Sylphie envisioned with RUDEUS.
Oh.
Okay.
So, I suppose that's why she wasn't too fussed when Rudy kind of dropped a hint that he has had the coitus before. Because she was a bit like, oh, right, okay, cool. She wasn't like, oh.
Episode 30, I Don't Wanna Die, covering chapters 4 and 5 from Volume 8 of the light novel. With the month having passed since enrollment, we start things off with Rudy continuing his training regiment, a program that a lot of you may be familiar with as it directly references the same one that Saitama used.
Right.
Since Rudy didn't want to lose all his hair though, he figured he would just have to work a little bit harder than him. It was as he would do this training that he would occasionally...
So it's actually a proper reference to it, because obviously he's come from, that's dead cool. So he liked One Punch Man, or like he heard of it. Oh.
spot this one girl doing the same thing that he was. He couldn't recognize who she was, but he could definitely see just how fit she was. When that and the ensuing magic training were finished, Rudy would then grab breakfast with Zanaba, head to the library for research, eat lunch with Zanaba, then go to classes on healing magic, divine magic, and barrier magic. Before we get to the details of those classes though, there were times when Alina Lise would check up on him, but because he was always with Zanaba, she would never stay very long since to her, Zanaba wasn't a good man. As for the lunch itself, the dish they keep showing over and over is called Nana Hoshiyaki,
Right, does
a
look
kind
nice.
of pseudo-karage that was often served with the curry lookalike.
That does look good.
If you remember what I mentioned last episode, then I think it's safe to assume that these were the menu items added by that Master Silent Zanaba was referring to. Now, the anime only mentioned each of Rudy's classes briefly, but there was actually a few lessons from each that Rudy found quite interesting.
Oh, okay.
The healing class didn't really cover anything helpful to his specific problem, but the other two did seem rather
Divine
useful.
magic and barrier magic,
So,
okay.
for divine magic, he found it worked similarly to disturb magic. It was the practice of using raw mana to attack the enemy. Normally, mana would be channeled then transformed into some form of element, but if the enemy was something like a ghost-type creature, then a pure mana attack could be used to damage it. Of course, an attack like that didn't actually do damage to other things, so a skilled divine magician needed to be able to analyze and modify their magic accordingly. Changing your magic to counter your opponent was apparently crucial in combat. As for barrier magic, this was more so used to isolate magic. It was a highly practical tool that served as the core concept behind the magic-resistant bricks. Usually such barriers were constructed through magic circles, but at the beginner level they could also be made with incantations. These were typically barriers that could only block magic. The intermediate level taught those to create barriers that blocked physical attacks, then at the saint level and above the two could be combined into a single barrier, at which point they became highly useful in both protection and confinement. This was something Rudy would unfortunately never learn here though, since the rights to divine and barrier magic were owned by Millis. The teacher was definitely capable of teaching it, but the very practice of doing so was illegal.
Oh my god, so people within this world own the rights to certain types of magic. And... alright.
If he or anyone else was caught teaching it above the basic level, then the Millis faith would hunt them down and put them on trial.
That's mad.
It was a direct violation of the law that Millis took very seriously.
Oh my god, that's crazy.
That being the case, rather than focus on how to create these barriers and strengthen them, Rudy's class instead focused on how to shatter them. It was all essentially a review of what Roxy had taught him. When we get to the library with Fitz next, it turns out the Fatoa incident may not have been as unique as we initially thought it was. Through all the books that Rudeus has been reading, he discovered various incidents fundamentally similar to Fatoa's. Sure,
Just
they
not
weren't
on
as large in scale,
right,
but there were numerous
yeah.
cases in which
Not to that
people
extent.
abruptly disappeared then returned from somewhere completely different. He had essentially found that this wasn't the first instance of people suddenly getting spirited away one day. In fact, it was actually quite the frequent phenomenon.
Oh.
Sylphie had been trying to research the same, but rather than look into teleportation as a whole, she was instead trying to see if there was a pattern behind it. If she could figure out a pattern in the way people were teleported, then perhaps she could make finding specific individuals easier.
Easier, right? Yeah,
That
yeah,
was her approach before Rudy found her. Of course, Sylphie felt bad that she was never actually able to search for Rudy, but Rudy understood that Fitz had his own life to live. The fact he was even able to do research while protecting the princess was amazing. Even more so when you consider how he leveraged his position to gain access to places in which that research could even be done. So, considering the extent Fitz had gone to find his friend, Rudy truly believed that that was enough. Now, it was during their walk home that Sylphie would comment on the whole Xanaba situation. You see, as someone who was at the school before him, she was actually witness to just how much of a troublemaker he was.
Okay.
Obviously, he's not so much now, but apparently after he enrolled, he would try to fight pretty much everyone.
Oh god, because
It was
he
a
is
time
strong,
of havoc
like,
that would
yeah.
last until Linnea and Persenna stepped in. We don't know exactly what they did, but as the widely proclaimed leaders of the delinquents, they had apparently challenged Xanaba and beat him 2-on-1.
Right.
It was a simple challenge that the two won rather easily. So
it's
it was ever
2-on-1
since
as
then
well,
that
though.
Xanaba would be treated as their underling. Linnea and Persenna would then try to do the same thing against the princess, but Sylphie had stepped in and defeated them 1-on-2.
Nice.
It was a humiliating defeat that declared Sylphie the strongest.
Okay,
In fact,
go ahead.
in her entire time here at the school, there wasn't a single person who could beat her 1-on-1. She had never lost a fight until the one with Rudeus,
Right.
which I guess by the transitive property makes him the strongest now.
Yes.
So, as Sylphie gave her warnings for each of the special students, she would even mention how Master Silent was a troublemaker. Not so much now, just like Xanaba, but even she had caused several problems back when she first enrolled. In any case, that would be it for the stuff with Sylphie. Where that brings us to next then is Rudy's more precarious situation with Xanaba.
His whole thing with statues, weird, man.
His lustful passion was something Rudy would
freak.
never judge him for, because after walking in on him in this scene here, that was all that was needed to show just how serious he was. It didn't matter what his motives for figure making were, because any person willing to get frostbite rubbing up against bronze in the cold of winter is definitely not faking their dedication for it.
Definitely not.
So, seeing just how passionate and impatient Xanaba was getting,
So
Rudy finally
weird.
decided to start training him. Of course, that wasn't without hoping to get something out of it for himself, though. You see, because he knew just how rich Xanaba was, Rudy believed he could help him make a profitable business of sorts. If he could eventually come to make use of his assets, then somewhere down the line he could start coloring and mass-producing his figurines. This world already had the technology to create bronze and Western-style statues, so all it needed to mass-produce others was just a little reappropriation. His plan was to start with the Roxy figure, then hopefully move on to Ruijerd. After which
I
he would
miss
write a
him
couple
so
books
much.
on them, then sell the two together as part of a bundle. It was a multi-phased
Alright.
plan that first needed to start with Zanoba. Thus the reason Rudy was going to take teaching him seriously.
Interesting.
Just as we saw in the anime though, Zanoba didn't have nearly enough mana to make even one figure.
No.
It was the first time Rudy had come face to face with just how much greater his own mana pool was. His entire life he thought his was at most 5 times bigger, but after seeing Zanoba struggle with something he could do hundreds of times over, that's when Rudy began to realize that perhaps his was significantly bigger.
Wow, 50,000.
Apparently
Jesus.
making figurines was a highly mana intensive task that not just anyone could imitate. So, when the chiseling method didn't work either, that's when Rudy would seek out Sylphie's help, bringing us to the whole suggestion of getting a slave to do it. If you're wondering why Sylphie had even suggested that, well, the justification was pretty much this.
I had to participate in the custom.
Well, you'd be morally irresponsible if you did not participate in the custom.
It seems when someone in the capital didn't have the skills to do what they wanted, they would instead buy a slave and teach them how to do it. A suggestion that made Rudy think, well, why not just cut out the middleman? If he could spend his days living in Shirone's royal palace making figures and lots of money too, then that didn't seem like too much of a bad idea to him. To him, being Zanoba's personal figure maker didn't seem all that bad. So that was a job he kept in the back of his head in case he ever needed one. Now, as much as it was a surprise to Rudy, according to Sylphie, buying a slave to do something you couldn't do was widely accepted across the world. Zanoba didn't like the notion of his master teaching a slave over him, but considering the circumstances of what led them to this, it was the only option left that could possibly work for him. So, unlike how it is in Milis or the Central Continent, the slave trade here was legalized, resulting in it becoming a core part of its economy. Thus the reason there was a place to purchase them right in the heart of the commerce district. In fact, for a city as large as this one, there were actually 5 slave markets from which Rudy could choose from.
Wow.
Since each catered to a different type of client though, Rudy had decided to focus on a more beginner-friendly one that tended to sell to the more wealthy clientele. Now, a comedic scene the anime didn't include involving Zanoba was yet another showcase of his powers as a blessed child.
Right.
You see, Rudy had tried talking to the person managing the information center, but as soon as that person saw the wealthy-looking noble behind him, he completely ignored Rudy and went to him
Rude.
instead.
Rude.
Zanoba didn't like the fact that his master had just been ignored, so in a classic Zanoba move, he clawed the person's face, held him up with one single hand, then threatened to rip his jaw off if he ever did it again.
Whoa.
I know this doesn't sound very funny, but it's the way Zanoba literally shrugs off the burly guards trying to subdue him that really just adds to the whole ridiculous nature of his character.
Yeah, he is so
Like,
strong.
all he
It's
had to
mad,
do to
isn't it?
fling these guards was just slightly move a bit.
Oh, right.
Something about this that was a bit more interesting was actually Sylphie's reaction to it. You see, the moment the guards had started trying to seize Zanoba, Sylphie immediately stepped in front of Rudy ready to protect him. She was agile, quick, and even had her wand up already, showing both us and Rudy just how skilled she'd become. It was after the merchant came and calmed everyone down that the trio would then head to the back to go see Julie, a young girl whose parents were both dwarven craftsmen. Since her father was a smith and her mother a crafter of jewelry, the merchant figured her potentially dexterous hands would be a good
Makes
fit for what Rudy
sense.
wanted
That
from
does
her.
make
The
sense.
thing is, since the merchant never thought that he'd actually be able to sell her, he didn't really bother to maintain her health. So Julie was in a state far worse than what we saw even in the anime. Whereas here you could still distinguish her as a child, both the novel and manga depict her as more of this skeleton. Her eyes were lifeless, her skin pale, and her entire body quivered not because of the cold, but instead because of just how weak it was. It was an abhorrent sight
Grim.
that made Rudy want nothing more than to help her as fast as possible. The only reason he didn't, though, was because her empty eyes didn't seem to indicate that she wanted saving. They were eyes that Rudy was all too familiar with.
Oh.
The circumstances definitely weren't the same, but the despair was enough to know that this girl may want the same thing that he would have wanted back then. And it was for that reason that Rudy asked if she wanted him to end it for her. This next part Rudy never explicitly states, but I assume he's presenting an option that he himself was never given. I mean, he does say how he wanted to die, but unlike how Julie was given a choice here, there was no one around to grant him that same type of mercy. So, knowing all too well the pain of carrying on while no hope existed for the future, I assume he was giving an out that perhaps he may have wanted back when he was in the midst of his peak despair. A dark turn that I honestly wasn't expecting this episode. Now, obviously that was my own personal interpretation of the scene, so if you happen to have your own thoughts, I'd love to see them down in the comments. Let me know if you think I was right or perhaps if there was more or less to it. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this
interesting.
episode. Juliet was bought for 10 Asura in copper, and she was then taken to get cleaned up and fed just like how we saw in the anime. Now, if you want to see the next cut content early, then you can check it out live every Sunday over on my Twitch channel. If not, then be sure to subscribe with notifications on to know when the next one comes out. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time.
Ciao. Cool. I like the whole, like, yeah, there's loads of stuff left out from, like, Sylphie's perspective and stuff. That's cool. And more explanation on why that girl was chosen. That made sense. Yeah, cool. Awesome. I'm really enjoying season 2. Are you guys enjoying season 2? Like, I think it's really, really good. And I'm waiting for Rudy to clock on, man. He needs to, like, click that is. But, yeah, anyway. Thank you to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video I upload, link in the description to the Patreon page. $1 month for support channel. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you for that. And thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe, even really. Leave comments down below. Let me know that I should watch some future videos. I'll see you guys next time.